or anything like that recently? Or
we've been really surprised and very fortunate this year. It's actually been a busier year than any other. So I don't know quite why that's the case, but we've actually kind of employed 3 new people during lockdown. But I know that that's not the case in a lot of other practices, and I know a lot of practices, I guess if your specialism is one of these sectors that have really been hammered, whether it's of commercial buildings or retail or hotels or something, really, those practices have really suffered. But but for us, I think possibly because we specialise in finding new uses for existing buildings a lot of the time, and a lot of it is residential, that people are still, the residential work is still happening because people are still living, and then there are a whole bunch of people with buildings that might no longer be doing the use that they were doing, and they're thinking, how do I change this into something else? So they tend to look us up. So we've got a guy that had some office space in East London, a kind of nice mixed-use building for shared office space, that he's foreseen that's going to be really difficult to kind of occupy next year. And after, there's going to be a lot of competition for those spaces. So he's asked us to look at new ways in which he could use that space. And that is definitely a kind of COVID project in a way.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting, like most of the firms we've had during this series have all been quite small firms. Yeah. And pretty much all of them has said a similar thing in terms of they've actually, work has anything picked up.
Yeah.
Even speaking to like my old practice as well, like it's just, I think it does seem to be the bigger firms that have been affected more than others at the moment. Which
no, I think that is, I'm sure that's the case. I think that I mean, apart from the fact that I think if you're a small firm like us, you're a bit more kind of malleable, and you can you can adjust and adapt to the things that are around. Whereas if you're more like a massive train of doing a certain type of project, it's very difficult to suddenly pitch yourself as being a different type of practice.
Yeah, of course.
So if you're reliant on certain type of work, I think it's been very hard for those guys.
Do you want to start showing me slide then, or we'll kick things off in a minute?
Kicking off right now. What you mentioned to Sarah on the phone that you wanted this to be about an hour, 45 minutes, no, half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that?
Yeah, just see how it goes, really. I don't think there's any particular time limit, but yeah, half an hour to 45 minutes with a few questions after would be ideal, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, I mean, please, because this is a pretty odd way of meeting everyone, I would be very happy if people, I don't know if there's a way people can interrupt, but you'll be welcome to ask any questions along the way if I'm not making myself clear on stuff. But okay, so my name's Jonathan Tuckey. I run a practice in my name down in London, specialising particularly, well, we've kind of been going for 20 years, and I've been really interested in finding ways to adapt existing buildings. It was a type of work that 20 years ago most architects wanted to avoid, and I was always really interested in it. But it's become a bit more accepted and exciting and mainstream for people to think about reuse as a kind of genuine form of architectural kind of how you can think about architecture. And I'm glad that a lot of other people are now as interested in it as I am. I'm going to show 2 projects today: a small residential one and a theatre. I've kind of by mistake ignored the brief that one of you sent me saying, can you talk about peeling back layers of historic buildings? And that wasn't intentionally avoiding it, but I have chosen 2 projects which are which kind of do that a bit, but I guess they're just to sort of explain a way of working and a way of thinking in a way that we approach projects in the studio. So the first one is essentially it's a flat in London on a street called Upper Wimpole Street, but I want people to think about it as in a broader term of when buildings are originally designed and then along the way change, they're kind of, the way they can work as a building sometimes no longer works. And part of your job as an architect, I think, is sometimes to kind of understand that, unpick that, and put that back together. And this is the case in this building. It was originally a single house at some point, 200 years ago, and along the way, as with a lot of things, got segmented into separate flats, one on each floor. And that kind of simple act, albeit it's still residential in use, fundamentally changed the properties, the character of the building, and essentially leaves behind a whole bunch of problems that people were living with, that we were kind of, our task was to kind of think about and address. And ostensibly that is visible in these images here, is because our clients had this floor, these two windows. That's a main door that everyone shared, but this was their flat. And what happened was, this is buses, like a public thoroughfare, that these buildings essentially, as you can see on this one and on this one, people are living right against the street, and the buildings were never intended to be living against the street. And so there's they're no longer kind of fit for purpose. Not in a way, of course they're dry and they kind of provide accommodation, but to live behind shutters or closed windows is not a kind of decent way to live. And it's a problem that exists, whether around the corner from where I live on the Harrow Road in West London, you can see these shops here. They were originally probably very thriving street at some point when the high street was activated. But I think we can all see now that the high street is going to go through a fundamental change. And so something that was designed for one use as a shop is now being appropriated by other uses, in this case, near me, people living behind them. And these are kind of disastrous living spaces in some respects, if they're not thought about carefully, because you end up living behind a white glass or a kind of curtain and carrying out your daily life without any aspects in view. So whilst this project is particular to a building, I think you can think of this problem as something that our job as architects is, we're kind of open to thinking about how we can come up with solutions for it. So I'll kind of kick off by just saying, something about maybe something very obvious to you about the kind of classical orders. If you think of a column, it's and the language of classical architecture, it isn't uniform. It goes without saying, but it has a bottom, a middle, a top, and something that rests on it, and it's made up of those component four parts, and each one of them on their own doesn't really make sense. Each one of them on their own is something that doesn't fulfill its function and its proportion. And if you were to kind of think of a building in that sense, and what's happened to the building that we're about to talk about in the way of a column, you can kind of start to see how we think about addressing it. Classical architecture is very clever and captivating in that way, because it's a kind of language that can be it's got the component of the column, but then it also that component can be then placed within a building. So if you look at this well-known building that people, if they haven't been to, should visit one day in London, is the John Soane's house, which is now a museum. This is, let's just imagine this could be any section through any classical building, and you can see that just like the column had a bottom, middle, and a top, this building has a bottom, middle, and a top, and the spaces in the basement here are a very different proportion to the spaces on the upper levels. There's these kind of low spaces contrast with the higher ones, and then they're interrupted by bigger ones that sort of that dominate in some respects the overall composition of it. And I think that it's that idea that a building is made up of parts that are all performing their own function is something that I think is a way you can look at and understand a classical building. You can take a room, a classical room, and it's somehow similar. I mean, it just, you know, to repeat what I've said about the column and then the section, those separate components equally exist here. It isn't just continuous between the base of it and the top. The room in itself has these datum and proportions and delineations that determine that the ceiling is somewhere different from the floor. And this is different from a modernist building. I mean, if you think about a modernist building and a modernist column, that set of components are very different. And the kind of rules get rewritten in the 1920s when the modernists appear, and Corbusier particularly writes a lot about it. But I think that understanding buildings older than that in this way of the components, and normally they have, those components represent scales, small, medium and large, bottom, middle and top, and it's about those things each providing a different function. This is a plan of Sir John Soane's Bank of England that he designed for the Bank of England in the centre of London, and the kind of intriguing, you know, relationship I showed you in the section on those last two images is just as visible in a plan. There's nothing kind of uniform about the arrangement and the kind of the accumulation of spaces. Yeah, the arrival is a distinct and different proportion from the kind of the next sequence of spaces that take you from one space to another, and each of them will be appropriated a different proportion to another, and that will to some degree determine the use of that space. So there's a kind of large space for a bigger amount of people, and a small space for a smaller amount of people, or a large space for a kind of a certain atmosphere compared to a small space for a different atmosphere. And whether it's a classical building or this is a medieval castle that was drawn, Louis Kahn did these beautiful drawings and studies of castles at kind of early stage of his career. And a lot of these castles in Scotland, he drew them, and I mean he drew them for a different reason, which was about how to understand the primary space and the spaces that support it, the kind of principal room, the service space and the served space, and then the spaces that serve it. And I think again, I think it's my observation and point about this is that they depend upon one another to perform their individual function. They are kind of they have a symbiotic relationship between one another, that if you take one of them away, you take all of those spaces around the perimeter away, this no longer can perform its function because it can't be served by those spaces around it. And equally, if you were just left with those perimeter spaces without anything to serve, they would be without their function. And I think there's the same to be said about these spaces in classical architecture in particular. You get this beautiful beautiful freedom with which to create spaces of different volumes and shapes, so that they can perform a kind of very different spatial arrangement. And this very beautiful vestibule here, which allows the kind of orientation of you to move through a space and then into these various different antechambers off it, in a way that just simply a rectangular space is less able and less easy to manipulate and create. So now back to the project itself and the plan that we started with. Are these clear? Are these clear for people to see? Are you able to see this, Adam?
Yeah, that's clear.
Cool. Okay, so this this is the apartment that we started with. This is the apartment that the client came to us with. As I said to you, it's on Upper Wimpole Street, which is here, and it was the ground floor it's a ground floor apartment. And what you can, it's already been changed, but you can start to see just in the thicknesses of walls that when it was originally a single house, you'd have walked in through this kind of hallway here, and you would have arrived, well, you would have had off that hallway one principal room here, and then there would have been another room, another kind of supporting room there, connected possibly by kind of large double doors or something. So, whoops. So that, you know, thinking of the Louis Kahn analogy, this is the space that serves these two spaces. They can't kind of exist without one another. And my point about the street, you know, you can tell that that in that current, when the whole building was a house, this would have been the front room. And, you know, the front room in buildings like this would have been almost rooms that were a gift to the street, almost a space that you never kept those closed. You only performed the more public functions of life, and, you know, special occasions, you know, Christmas, birthday celebrations, or whatever it might be. And the idea that that front space needed to be separate from the street was never a necessity, because there were always other spaces behind that you could have put your feet up on the sofa or watch the television. You know, it had in itself these filters that were already implied, because you had other spaces on other levels for the acts of sleeping or kind of retreat from the street. For some reason, occasionally my mouse stops working, but anyway. So if you ignore the kind of the new things that were added, the toilets here, the kind of hallway here, and these other spaces, this plan would have been very legible and would have been, you know, a hall, a large room, and then a medium-sized room. And then possibly, I don't know, but I'm guessing kind of some supporting even smaller room there, so that in a sense, you know, the most private part of the house on the ground floor would have been here. And you would have walked through the rooms there. There would have been no internal corridor. It would have just been a sequence of 3 spaces, because you had all the spaces upstairs. Someone at some point, because they needed to, converted this and added some bathrooms and hallways into it. So by the time we arrived, you had a kind of small hallway here, and a little kind of bathroom associated with a bedroom, a bathroom associated with another bedroom, a kind of small kitchen, and then they'd built this little kind of glass box in the garden for kind of eating, I guess. Some pictures of it as it was when we arrived, kind of, because it's on the ground floor, you know, massive ceilings, really exciting to have. You know, to really kind of uplifting to be in a space that had such great height, and again, which is on the face of it a real luxury to have, but you're faced with difficult challenges when you start to have to carve that up into smaller bathrooms and smaller spaces. Those proportions that were so important to the classical arrangement of the space suddenly don't work, because you've just got this tower-like spaces that really make a small space not actually feel very good or successful. Other, you know, the kind of galley kitchen and the front room, which they were using for a bedroom that had these curtains closed most of the time, and then, you know, pretty badly put in cupboards that sort of that don't really have a very good relationship with the cornice at the top of the room. So the whole thing feels like it needs something more considered in terms of how that space will work, because they were essentially sleeping with the buses going past the window. The other thing, actually, I'll jump back 3 slides. So the problem for them was not only was that very immediate onto the street, but also because of this kind of this peculiar, well, because of this introduction, this hallway here, the bed felt right next to the hall. So in an ideal world, you want to make that feel quite a lot further from that. You don't want everyone to arrive and just suddenly see the bed. It's sort of that layering of spaces that successful accommodation should have feels too immediate. I mean, I know it's not the case when you're in a student hall, but the idea that is in a house there is a sort of a number of spaces that take you to that more private space is a kind of convention that certainly in European and UK domestic architecture is kind of familiar, and they felt very sort of compromised between the bedroom and the hallway. Some kind of key strategies that we talked to the client early on about in terms of how could we intervene in that building, how could we kind of add things to those big rooms to provide filters or layers. So we really found that this image on the left was very useful. It's a picture of St. Jerome in his study. But if we imagine that our intervention, what we might do was this timber structure, and that this space here beyond and around was the existing room, we thought, well, that was quite a nice strategy in the way in which you could make a space that felt more intimate for the act of, in this case, the guy's study, and still allow the whole room to have a proportion of its own. So it wasn't like smashing up the room was still legible, but the act of the study was given a slightly more separate proportion, both by stepping up to it, by removing it from the floor, and by acting as a kind of screen between the activity study and whatever might be happening behind. Maybe his bedroom is behind that space, or maybe there's another use behind there. But it was quite a key. I guess it was useful for us to understand, to see that, and then to explain to the clients that's how we thought we could provide them with these alterations. Another image by Sohn, again, of something different, where within a bigger space that might start here and end at the back wall, there could be a screen or a device that would act as a sort of separator, not completely separating, but giving a degree of layering from one space to another. And equally, I mean, the other complaint or concern they had with the existing building, and you could see it in those pictures, is there was nowhere for them to put anything. There was, they had a coat rail for their clothes and their books all over the floor. There was no built-in storage. And thinking of a way in which these devices of screens or cabinets could both kind of act as a place to put things, but act as a layering on the existing building. So some pictures of the alterations that we made. I'll show you. I hope I show you a plan. Now I think about it. I think there's a plan coming up. But this is the main room, and what's been added is this sort of kind of layer of cabinetry around, which, in our mind, does a number of things. On the face of it, the very simple thing is it's a whole bunch of storage. Behind everything there is their stuff, but it equally acts as a sort of as a proportioning system between the tall room and something that's a bit like St. Jerome in his study, something that mediates the scale of the person in the space and the high ceiling. It's a kind of a datum, like a picture rail that we put round in brass all the way around the perimeter, off which they can hang pictures, and we clip lights to. So again, it almost at night occupied a way in which there's a lower level of light into the room and the ceiling gets left free. And certain details in that. think I've realised it's probably we're not going to come to a plan, which is a shame. But so this is the kind of entrance hall, the space that I said between the front door and the other rooms of the apartment. And what we did in that space, if you could remember, it was previously I'll just jump back to the drawing actually, because it might be good to explain it again. Okay, so the entrance hall previously, well, the room previously had this very beautiful curved corner to it, which you would have opened up and seen the fireplace. That would have been, come in to the hall, and if you wanted to come into the main room, the main feature was this fireplace, which obviously destroys immediately by the time this partition goes in. We had to keep the partition because they clearly needed a bedroom and a hallway. So what we built was another piece of joinery, another piece of cupboards that forms an equal curve to that, running around that side there. This WC went and becomes part of a bigger bathroom there. And that just that simple curve there that then runs into the joinery that you saw a picture of here means that as you sort of come in, I think it softens that arrival. You're not looking straight at the corner, and it kind of directs the main flow, I suppose, of the kind of the public route, if you think of it as a kind of guests or something, in to that curve and into that space there. So that is there. That's that curve there. So it's sort of, by the time that you come in, I mean, it's actually where their coats and shoes are kept, but it's also something that guest coats and things like that, essential storage for the flat that didn't have much. And previously the floor throughout was just all timber. Again, it was modernist in its agenda, in the sense that it was one floor finish throughout. It was like completely uninterrupted and didn't allow you to pause or think about a change in pace between the arrival and the next space. So that we laid in this area these tiles just to act as a kind of stasis between the arrival and the spaces beyond that. That view is actually looking through into the bedroom, and you can see that what we created in there is a screen. So you can start to see a screen that kind of goes across the middle of the room that separates the bedroom from a wardrobe, a dressing room space. And that was then had a change in level, a bit like the St. Jerome's thing, so that it doesn't feel like everyone is welcome just to kind of head into there. As definitely a threshold between that space and the space beyond, and pushes the bed closer to the window, which we then dealt with shutters, but nonetheless further away from the front door. And this is looking from the back of the apartment, through the living room, through the hall, and into there. So you get this sort of long, you still get this long procession of views, but they're all characterized by different proportions of different materials and a different quality of light and color to kind of act as spaces of their own. I think, just like all those earlier images I was showing you about rooms and a building being a collection of rooms, I think giving those rooms a different materiality or a different color or a different ceiling somehow is in the spirit of how an original classical building was devised. So we really needed to take what existed throughout the whole building and then compress it all into this one apartment. That is the screen that goes from the bedroom into the dressing room. So there's the street beyond the bedroom. The bed is tucked in behind here. So there are these two archway doors, one on this side of the bed and one on the other side of the bed. And then behind it, which is the kind of the place for dressing. And then you can just start to see half height shutters there, so you can close the windows to a half height. If you want to be in there in the day, you still get these big tall windows in the space without the feel of the need to have to shut everything off. and that's within the dressing room space. The joiner did a really beautiful job making these. It's all made in MDF, but they kind of curved. They curved the MDF in these areas just to have this sort of sculpted roots through and around the space. Again, I think bringing something of the language of the original building and the different complexity of the original building all into the one apartment. Again, we allowed the whole room to still be read as one, so that cornice that was originally there just gets kept, and then this lining of a new, it's like a sort of inserted new object that sits within the space. And another view of that there. Some more views of the study. Okay, so a completely different project on a different scale, different use. This is a theatre that we recently finished in September, that we've been working on for 3 or 4 years, for a school in Berkshire, kind of an hour and a half out of London. It's in quite a rural area. These are kind of fields and forests around, and it's just on the top of a hill. Oh, it's an incline, not a big hill. The school's called Horus Hill, and it's kind of on a raised bit of ground. The land falls away on either side. It's a boarding school where people sleep, where the pupils sleep there, and it kind of historically was this amalgam of buildings. Originally, 2 or 3 buildings here that grew and grew. Then there were some later buildings that I think came in the 80s here, and a group of kind of sheds that were along the side, I think probably just to maintain the grounds or to support the kind of looking after the playing fields and the playground and things like that. And as the school had grown over in the last 25 years, I guess, so they had increasingly expanded the activities of teaching and sleeping from these spaces into these spaces here. And so there was the school had eventually become these spaces, albeit these always felt slightly detached from there, both in terms of how well they'd been built and how they felt kind of further away, let's say. That's the right hand side. So we're now this side here. This photograph is taken from here, and you'll see the kind of original building, and then some buildings in the 70s and some buildings in the 80s that all around with trees and playing fields around it. And the buildings on the other side were these kind of low, I call them sheds. I mean, this was dressed up. This was now been converted into classrooms, but it was essentially slightly less well-considered buildings. I mean, I don't particularly like the original buildings, but these ones were a lot worse. And in between them and the school was this single-story. It wasn't a porter cabin, but it was a kind of timber-framed building which they used for DT, and it felt pretty kind of didn't feel like it had much more life in it. And you can see again looking in, that's the DT building that goes off on this side here, and these are the kind of the more shed-like structures compared to the ones for the school. It wasn't helped by the fact that all the staff and visitors were parking their cars in here, so it really felt more like a kind of out-of-town car park shopping centre rather than a school, and didn't have I think it felt in sort of civic qualities and qualities of a sort of how a town or city might operate. It felt ill-considered and like the kind of out-of-town extensions that had arrived. You can see them here. This is the DT building here, and that became the site for the theatre. So this is a plan, the first plan that we drew of the school, and we wanted to use we talked about a lot to the school about the kind of analogy of this being a small town rather than like something like a civic space which has squares and streets and connections, and that we needed to kind of bring that seemed to already exist in this space here. There were spaces, there were kind of bigger spaces, smaller spaces off it. There were little alleys. It had that quality of all the richness that you might find in a small old town, whereas because of the car parking and because of the quality of the buildings here, this really didn't feel like that, or it did feel like the kind of out-of-town shopping centre that's badly planned. And we wanted to bring some of that quality by placing a new building there that sort of redefined the school and almost dragged the centre of the school that felt like it was here to there. And if we could create a new centre of the school in this place, somehow the whole campus would gravitate around that. It was partly the head teacher had studied and was interested in classics. I think he had done classics at university or something, and he really was passionate about it. Previously the pupils were using the gym for theatre. The gym was one of these sheds here, so the gym had was a corrugated tin box. It had a flat floor as is needed for a gym, and so therefore both for a theatre it wasn't very appropriate because you didn't get that ability to see very well. You had to lay out the chairs the whole time and move them away every time there was needed to be used as a gym. But also acoustically it was terrible because it had this very, very high ceiling, brilliant for volleyball and basketball, but not good for theatre. And he felt that it was, if we were to think of this as a kind of mini town, it was essential for education to have a theatre as a permanent theatre, a theatre that form a permanent function within the life of the school and within the kind of the education that people were being provided. I mean, you'll probably know this, but the sort of origins of theatre in an ancient sense are that it was really the place in the city or the place in the town or the place in the community where you could act out things that were not allowed in kind of everyday life. You could fall in love with someone you're not meant to fall in love with. You could kill someone you're not meant to kill anyone at all. You could. Its role was to provide the kind of the full spectrum of activities that are kind of forbidden from our normal conventions of life. And that's the theatre in the city used to be outside the city walls and was for people to go and kind of let their hair down and to act out things that, both to see things acted out and to break taboos. That's what theatre was always for. It's only much more recently that it's become often quite a stiff and uptight place to be quiet and and to have the lights down and to watch something for expensive tickets. Actually, its role was really to challenge the conventions of life and to test out breaking the rules. And he felt that in a place like this, theatre really, in an education curriculum, theatre really needed a permanent home, not just for school plays and things, but actually for drama to become an essential part of the curriculum and for people to learn how to perform. I mean, I know you know that's what's amazing about an architectural education is you have crits and you have to stand up and present things, and you know, it's it's an amazing, terrifying but amazing thing to have to learn how to do. And actually, if that can be part of everyone's education, it kind of empowers you in later life to understand what presenting something is like, standing in front of a group and shouting something out, singing something out, or showing something off. So that's why he felt that theatre couldn't be just in the gymnasium. It needed to have its own place, and it needed to have fixed seating that couldn't be swept away. It needed to have a stage that was at the right height, and it needed to have the acoustics that people didn't have to feel intimidated by an echo, that the acoustics would work for a single pupil. Or, sometimes these pupils were young, so something that worked for them. So that became our remit, this site here, and thinking about how if the DT building moved the facilities into one of these other buildings, we'd place a theatre in this location. And this is a kind of early drawing of the streets of the school and the various different kind of alleys and courtyards and routes through it, and how if we felt the theatre had a permanent ground, like the seating was both dug in and raised out of the ground, and we and the headmaster were completely aligned that we didn't want the seating to be one of those removable seats that sort of compress away. It needed to be absolutely essential part of the landscape. That's something very permanent, and this is a drawing just thinking about how we could make something that was kind of forever, indelibly part of the landscape. If the building above it blew away at some point, this arena for performance was always going to be there and indelibly, irremovably present. These next 5 or 6 drawings were a bunch of drawings we did at the competition stage. There was a competition to get the project. I think 6 or so people were asked to do it, and these were done over a course of a week when we got their brief, and to some extent the project is very different, but to other extent some of the original ideas are still there. So we kind of showed, we just said, you've got this kind of amazing avenue of trees that is, at the moment, it feels like the school's on the right and the sheds are on the left, but let's make that kind of avenue into the city, you've arrived in the town and that's the town square. So could we think of the building as almost having not just a theatre, but could it actually have a function that was like a civic square, like the kind of meeting place for a community? We liked the fact that these trees would always produce sort of beautiful shadows on the building, and almost like a colonnade, a place for you to gather when it's hot and almost sort of hang out, like you see people sitting in the colonnade on a market square or something. Could the trees themselves become part of that? And maybe the facade could have something of the rhythm of those trees. In this case, we were imagining we were going to have a little gallery on one side of it that was partly open to this colonnade, and kind of light showing them this idea of what it could be, what it could look like. That was going to be the gallery on the inside. The idea was the entrance was along that side. You'd walk through a gallery and into the theatre, so that we were constantly trying to think of ways in which other things could come into the theatre, so that it wasn't just the drama kids or the assembly that was happening in there, but it might be that the art pupils could hang up their art in it, or there could be exhibitions in it. So I think it was the nature, and is the nature of a lot of architects, to sort of always try and expand the brief. And I think we would thought maybe it would be a nice idea to bring a gallery into it. It ended up, as with all these things, a lot of these things got cut because of cost, but that was the ambition, was again to try and make the building as public as possible, or as used by as many people in the community as possible. And then this was the kind of front. At this stage, the front we had coming from the south. I don't know why we did, but we did, and it was. You'll see we changed that, but you'd come into this foyer and then you go down the hall, you come down the gallery, and then into the main theatre. And then we also felt that it felt a shame to have a black box, a box that was great, perfect for theatre, but couldn't really, was pretty soulless for assemblies or for daytime drama lessons. So if we could have a way in which we could screen off have windows that looked at the trees around it, but then could be covered up by curtains or shutters or something, so that it could be as good for someone playing a concert or something during the day as for a production in the evening. So we were interested at this point about giving it, making it as useful to them during the day as it would be in the evening. And I think there was and still is a kind of, it felt environmentally, I always think it's crazy to just have buildings or rooms that you go into and you have to turn the light on. It would be nice to come in, even if it wasn't always bright, at least you could see. It just feels our responsibility as architects is to kind of think in that way, that you can go in and there's daylight. If you need to just go and get something, find something, it's not about always turning the lights on and therefore leaving them on. And we thought a lot about how it might be a lantern at night, so that as you kind of arrived in the school, this is a view of it from the other end, but as you arrived into it or saw it at night, times of the year like this when it's dark from about 4 o'clock, and the pupils are still at lessons, it could act as a sort of a bit of like a lantern in the middle of the school. Again, really just trying to think of ways in which we could make it more central in the life and in the position of the school. There was an idea at one point where it could feel good for just the school, but when everyone's parents were there, it would also feel good. So we didn't want it to feel empty when the parents weren't there. So that was going to be closed off. And if assembly Monday morning, it'd be closed off, and then when everyone was there, it would feel full. So there was an idea at this point of a way in which it could expand and compress depending on the amount of people that were there. These, again, were all sort of ideas, I guess, that helped conclude the competition rather than what we ended up with. And because at that point we had turned it a different way around, we thought that maybe what could happen is that the back of the theatre, and times when they wanted to not be inside but outside, they could open massive doors to the back of the theatre, and they could perform or kind of gather people in this space here. And so that there would be a sort of, you get 120 people in the theatre, but you could have 240 people out here on a summer evening or something, and it would actually be an outdoor stage. So at that early stage, just like the gallery idea, we were thinking of how many things that we could add to this theatre, so that it wasn't just a theatre. They were having to raise money, and we wanted to try and say to them, let's not make this just a theatre, let's make this a theatre, an assembly hall, an outdoor theatre, a gallery, and just have all these other attributes and components to it. And there was this drawing that was thought of as well about how the building should be able to heat and light it and ventilate itself. So the issue with theatres is you don't really have to heat them, because when they're full of people, the people themselves, each person that sits in the theatre gives off a kilowatt. So if you've got 120 kilowatts in there, it gets warm very quickly. So all you've really got to do is actually ventilate it, and you can either do that mechanically with air conditioning, or you just simply need to open louvers or ventilation at the bottom on either side, and something at the top, and you get this kind of chimney effect of cool air coming in and the hot air going out. And this is a nice temporary theatre that Howard Tompkins did in London for the National Theatre, and that's what these chimneys were for. These were sort of taking the hot air out, that's cool air brought in the lower level, and taking the hot air out, and felt that would be a really good strategy where you could then just avoid the idea of expensive and kind of environmentally insensitive ventilation, and just actually bring air in and bring air out. So those were the initial kind of things that we pitched to the client. The things that kind of were in our mind that we had knocking around the studio at the time, which we didn't really share with the client, were images like this, which we kind of knew that we knew that a theatre is essentially a kind of massive box, and without, in the wrong hands, that could just become like a kind of enormous B&Q shed, really. I mean, we needed to think of a way in which we could articulate the facade like these buildings in Florence here, which would bring a three-dimensionality, a thickness, a kind of layering to the facade. So that was kind of, we didn't know how we were going to sort it out, but we knew that we were interested in kind of ennobling this shed. And these architects, Alberti and Gambarelli, but also Palladio, were absolute, they were in their time extraordinary at introducing proportion to facades that allowed a kind of three-dimensionality to them that broke up and articulated a building. I mean, if you actually think about this building here, it's got three openings on that level and one opening on this level, but the kind of layering and the drawing on the facade of these different sets of proportion, a bit like that classical order, completely determine and delineate it. We also thought that this was an idea for us, that the kind of civic square, creating a square, and we were interested in that, and we noticed that this one was north facing, and it gave us confidence that maybe we should flip the building round and have the front of the theatre where I previously had the back, and you would come in through the front door, and that courtyard of spaces would actually kind of make it a proper square, rather than leaving the theatre into the playing fields, which suddenly felt so wrong for us. And we liked the fact that these buildings were at sometimes different angles, and that we didn't feel that we had to align our new building necessarily with the ones adjacent to it. So that's kind of tapering between this building here and that building as this one heads off, was something that produced quite an interesting dynamic and proportion to the very different spaces. And then, knowing that we weren't going to be making ours out of that kind of marble of those, that this church in Venice by Brunelleschi, which is kind of always thought of as the unfinished church, but the proportion and the simple materiality of this rusticated brickwork, this kind of stepped lines of protruding brickwork, gave us the confidence of a single material could work very well for this building. We didn't have the budget for anything other than a single material, but that made us think that we could work in that, and we weren't going to be concerned that wasn't going to produce something both sort of very heroic and yet ordinary, and sort of very epic in our space. These were some sort of study models along the way, and through in the costing, it all ended up becoming simpler. But you can see a sort of, we're desperately trying to find ways in which we can break down this big box. So we had the stage and the backstage, and then the auditorium, and then we thought of kind of adding some sort of portico onto the front would really signal and signify the kind of, again, entrance and gateway. And because it might have these multiple functions of a theatre entrance, but equally assembly, there might be a sort of side door directly into the auditorium that would be what the pupils would use every day for assembly. They wouldn't always come through the front theatre door, and that would be for the production. So that just by entering a door, it kind of adds two different faces to how the building was used. These are kind of small 1 to 200 models that you can start to see become a bit simpler. In certain ways, we lose as the money, with the reality of money kits, and we lose the big structure on that side, and just have the main celebratory structure on that end, and then a kind of side entrance for every day, and then doors for the backstage on this side. And again, other little study models. And you can see that we're starting on that roof to think of ways in which we can work with the acoustics of the ceiling, so that the auditorium, we thought, if it had Albert Alted, this very beautiful curved ceiling, which was designed to reflect voices of the production to people at the back of the auditorium. So that was kind of thinking about how this something curved, I mean, we would have had a flat roof on top, but something curved inside would bounce voices from the theatre to the people in the seats. We made a wooden model, partly just to, it's just great to be able to test these these little ones dropped in and out of it. And we had a model of the whole school, and then we would just drop the theatre into its space. And you can see that that's one of the little models sitting in the space. And what's shown here is that by turning it round, that becomes what we call the civic square. And we decided, because we preferred these buildings to these ones, we would line up our building with those and create this kind of tapering space with that. And it's almost like a gesture of welcoming this part to that part by having the alignment of this and that. So that becomes a right angle. This becomes this skewed wedge, which we took a lot of confidence from those Italian city examples. It also meant that this portico on the front here you could sort of, as you were coming from this part of the school, it would kind of draw you in, so you would arrive and see us, walk through that into this place here. These are starting to be some drawings of the theatre. You can start to see that public square here. The portico becomes a little bit simpler, and it's kind of foyer, and then the main auditorium. And the foyer, we lost the gallery, but we kept a colonnade along one side, so that there was no changing rooms in here for the theatre, because they could use some of the classrooms in here to change. Again, money, such like, and there were toilets and classrooms in here. So this becomes, when there's big production on, this serves as providing the loos and the changing. And then the pupils will come out here, go into this external colonnade and to the stage through a doorway there. And then the arrival into the theatre is under this colonnade here. And that's a view of it in the city, or in its environment. So the kind of it's at this point starts to take the same colour as the main. At one point it was going to be white, and then we thought, actually, let's think of a material that's the same tone as the red bricks that actually make all of the space around it. And by turning it around and making that square, we thought that what we would do is, that would be the kind of civic square, the kind of urban plaza to the place. But we still retain the idea that the back of the theatre could still open at the back, and we would create a kind of small amphitheatre with low timber benches around here, so that idea of an event, a bigger event, around the back of the theatre could be kind of summer production, or so they couldn't afford a big opening, but we just put 2 doors, a bit like you find on the those weather clocks that have a kind of man and a woman coming out the left and right door. Those would be the sort of stage doors that connect the stage, and you would come and do your production on the south-facing stage here into an amphitheatre. So, you know, we lost the gallery, lost a number of things, but we kept the idea that it was a theatre that had a public space at the front and a big external performance space at the back. It had a side entrance for the assemblies, and then this small cloister here that allowed a kind of, it made what was a place that was currently for the bins and a kind of suddenly a nice space with plants and things like that, and it's actually a little courtyard that gets created by that space. So here's a plan of it as it's currently built, as it is now built. So you can see this is now on the alignment of all those buildings there. That's the sort of urban square that's set in paving in the space. We persuaded the school to no longer put their cars in here, and that becomes a sort of singular space that suddenly is pedestrianised as part of the rest of the cars just get kept in that space. And that's the external amphitheatre, and it's now really just made of these 4 volumes: the stage, the auditorium, this wraparound section, part of which is internal, which is the very small foyer, and part of which is this colonnade, and then the timber portico structure at the front. Some drawings about how we would divide up the facade, you know, like drawing on a facade. As I say, it was these 2 big boxes, and we knew we had to have these low-level vents and high-level vents to get the natural ventilation, so those were given. So if we could think of a way in which we could conceal those, we knew we wanted daylighting, so there was going to be these other things that sort of slipped in their geometry, then the rest would be kind of panelized. And we found this material. It's actually made out of recycled timber and cement, and it's a panel board made in Portugal called Viroc, and it comes in 3 or 4 standard colors, and one of them happens to be very similar to the brick of the buildings around. So it kind of, we knew we could make it and afford to make it out of that, but it's only 18 millimeters thick, and so we really didn't want it to look like a thin, flat building. So we divided it up into panels that were then subdivided by these ribs that then give it this relief and 3-dimensionality that I think we found on those Venetian churches. That's a little kind of porch over the 2 doors on the back, and that's the freestanding timber structure that that kind of welcomes you at the front. And that's the little side door that was originally a big gateway, but just becomes a door with another protruding canopy over it. So that's the plan. You come in under the portico. It's the urban square, just visible in that drawing. You come in. This is the foyer. There's 2 loos in there. And you come around the side and into the auditorium, which is here. The stage that way. So it's very important for them and for us to have level access. So this is all level, so that you wanted to be able to get to the stage if you're in a wheelchair, all on one level, so that anyone can come and kind of act or perform or receive a prize just by being on one level. And then these seats step down into the ground and these seats step up. So this is all singular, this is all zeros as well. And then these step down to about -1 meter and step up to +2 or 3 meters, +2 meters. A couple of storage places for the machinery of the theatre. And then these 2 doors that go onto the back, which for this amphitheatre here, and then the seating that would be used if there was for summer productions, outdoor events or concerts. The upper level of the theatre, it no longer was 2 stories, but it carries on up above the the storage below it, and then this is a sort of sound booth that was super big, so that they could have a class of pupils could learn how to do lights and sound productions. So that's kind of the control booth. You can see the windows around the auditorium, 5 of them, all being able to be closed by a little manual, just wooden shutters, close it off. And then these are the vents at high level that I mentioned earlier about natural ventilation. Section through the theatre. So first thing to note is that, you know, that level access. So that's the route through. If you can't go up and down steps, there's the steps that rise up and the steps that dug down the ground. So that's that kind of feeling of that permanent structure that can't move. And then this is this curvaceous kind of acoustic ceiling that allows, it's worked out so that if you're standing there and you speak, it bounces the sound to these back spaces there. So actually it acts as a kind of way in which voice and instrument sound is more easily heard than if it was just onto a flat ceiling. So this construction took a year. It was the base of it was concrete, just like you can start to see these kind of foundation of it is all already been laid there. So it was just a concrete with this upstand, so that anything above it doesn't get wet. So there's a sort of tray of concrete, as it were, that stands up like that. And then the whole building was made in cross-laminated timber called CLT, came over from Austria on a lorry, and it meant that it went from this state to a finished box, not finished, but a kind of a complete box in 4 days, because it's essentially like a kind of a large flat pack construction. These are, I think they're 150 millimeters thick, and they have a bit of insulation, but they certainly allow the whole frame to be assembled very quickly. You start to see it going up there. While it's all being screwed together, they have to prop it up, and then once the roof and everything's on, those props come away. So this is the stage. This is the pit that those seats drop down into, and you can start to see the walls in position, and then something being craned in position there. And that's the theatre of the front. The holes for the openings are already cut in Austria, and then so they're all in the right position, and relatively easy for them to assemble quite quickly, which was quite important because with the school in operation, you didn't want to have too much heavy construction going on as a sort of health and safety thing. So it meant that during a school half term, they were able to assemble the whole thing, get these things craned into position, and then were able to just work on the facades much more locally without there being a risk to pupils who are still going around the perimeter. Start to see it coming together in that space there. So the windows are just being glued into position. That's the side door. The roof before it had the curvy ceiling, and the vents. These vents are made in an acoustic way, so they kind of open, but they baffle the noise. So they've got very thick foam in it that allows air through it, but really muffles the noise. So if a car passes or they're shouting outside, you can't hear through them. That's the backstage with its roof on. And the material itself was kind of really nice. I mean, this was the cheap grade stuff. They have a number of different grades where you can either use high quality timber to finish it, or medium or cheap, and we chose the cheap one. And it's it looked pretty amazing, really. At this point, it's still flat and not the three-dimensionality that we wanted, but it was perfect for the backstage area. That's the kind of side colonnade starting to come into position. So as a visitor theatre, you come down that space, but this is this external space that looks out onto the courtyard garden. And then the first arrival of these Varrock red panels. So the Varrock comes in, I think it's 3 metre by 1.5 metre sheets. And what we did is, from that drawing that you saw of the panel, we predetermined all the sheet sizes, and it just got cut, CNC cut in a factory, and delivered already cut. So again, it speeded up the assembly, but it meant that the labour cost was so much cheaper, because you just had, you gave it a CAD file, we minimised the amount of wastage, it cut it all, it arrived all labelled, and the builder had to assemble it like an IKEA, table or something, and it meant the speed and the cost of construction was minimised and reduced significantly. So here's some pictures of it finished. So that's the kind of view from the arrival. The square is in front of it. This is the kind of portico space, the kind of glazed foyer, window into the auditorium. These little louvers that provide the vents, and then a kind of overhanging eaves with these little steel brackets that we designed just to add some kind of ornamentation to the top of the building. That's it from the front, and this the new square that's laid out on that space, and the kind of side door, kind of very much in those trees, like one of those early drawings. You can still see the concrete upstand. The CLT, the timber has to sit on the concrete because it can't sit on the ground, so you get this sense of the sort of the tray of the building standing up. And then you can see the lower and higher vents that started off the way in which we could kind of articulate the facade. And I think, that three-dimensionality, we were really pleased at the way how creating a building out of something flat becomes still quite three-dimensional. So that three-dimensionality houses the downpipes, these sort of oversized pipes that spill out the water into gullies below. This is the kind of south the amphitheatre. You can see the seats there, and this concrete, the upstand wrapped around, and instead of it just being an upstand, we just gave the contractor a drawing to just pour a little bit more concrete, and for it to become a bench. It faces south. We just felt it was, you see in these beautiful Italian cities, the way people just gather on the base of a building. There's something that sticks out, and it's where everyone's playing chess or reading the newspaper or something. And it just felt that actually in a school like this, where people are living, it was you don't need to necessarily go into the theatre to be using it. If we can provide kind of furniture on the outside the building, and they'll lean up against it, they'll be getting a kind of use out of it in a way that they might not do if it had just been brought down flush. And so I think that kind of, I think it costs an extra £100 to have that in concrete, or £200 in concrete, but it provides this way in which that facade is, or in good weather, is always activated. I think that's quite nice to see how these are bad and ugly buildings, but the kind of tonality of it, I think, starts to work quite well as a group of buildings. That's another view of that. Those doors onto the south facade. We subdivided this lower level. Again, it could have just been all singular, but it just felt that these are almost a proportion of the width of the person, so that they're like big seat backs for a group of people that kind of sit up in a line along there, like in a council or a chamber. It's another view of that side with these overhanging shelters for the doors. The foyer at the front, the kind of small entrance hall, and walking down from that into the theatre, which is you come down here, and the theatre's on the left, and that's the theatre space. The So it is all just flat CLT walls, but the flat timber, Austrian timber walls, but that's then been subdivided by just very simple beech battens, 25 by 25 mil beech battens that get nailed or screwed onto the wall in this pattern, partly to help the acoustics, partly to ennoble and improve and change the impression of a flat timber box, and partly to bring in the proportions that we've talked about, where there's a kind of lower level and a medium level and a top level. And the grey sections in between there are acoustic material, just literally felt glued onto the CLT that absorbs some of the reverberation on the walls. And you can see the kind of sloping ceiling, which is just plywood bent plywood folded on a timber frame and just painted. That sort of makes the lights part of it. I suppose the lights and the sort of technical equipment at the high levels is all part of that. Next to the windows, each one of these is a shutter that can just be, there's a big long stick that you can pull up, put on a hook, and then swing that around and close these off, so that I think anyone, you can just send up anyone to ask them to darken the theatre, and you don't need to get the maintenance man or the piece of technology to close it. We wanted it to be very manual. There's that space. So that space is this sort of gallery on the left. The minstrels' galleries in these old theatres are so, places that you're not always sitting down. You might be standing somewhere throwing food onto the stage or shouting, or might be for late arrivals. So we just thought that somewhere that stops it from just being seating and stage, and something where you could kind of either continue the production from, actors can perform and talk and shout from there, but equally it's more like a little gallery space. And that's it there. That's a view from that gallery of the stage. And very nice to kind of see how in the daytime when it's used, those trees, the sort of the wood, the timber, view of the timber, the trees, I think we kind of like the way it collaborates with the timber of the surroundings. The benches, we designed these benches, again, it's just constantly up against it with the budget. So we kind of designed them out of MDF here in the office, and just got them CNC cut. So there were, it was a couple of grand to get all of the benches made. A guy in Cardiff got them all cut, and then they were assembled on site. They, you'll see, I'll show some pictures of them in a minute, but they kind of worked quite nicely as a sort of another layer of timber. I like that picture of the tree. That's kind of nice to see the sort of mad organic structure out the windows, and then the more rational composition. This is in front of the vents. And then their fundraising, there was a letter writer, we got a sign writer to write the names of various different people who contributed to paying for the building. I think that might be the last slide. No, that's the last slide. So you can do a little bit of a view of how those benches are. They were slightly inspired by a Macintosh, small Macintosh theatre up in Glasgow, I think in the art school, which had these, had this sort of simple ribbed legs and kind of open framed backs. So, and then we just got some foam and wrapped fabric on it for the seats to make them a bit more comfortable. And each of the seats was sponsored by someone, so when they were being cut by the CNC person, they also cut names into them, so that there's a sort of permanence about their contribution to the theatre. That is it.
Great, thank you very much, Jonathan. That's a really wonderful lecture with a couple of really beautiful schemes. I'll open the floor up to some questions, so if anyone has any questions, they can type in the chat. We've probably got time for 10 minutes or so. But I guess I'll quickly start things off with a quick question. Do you think your work obviously has a lot of influence from like historical contexts. Florence was mentioned. Do you think perhaps you might not know the answer to this? Do you think perhaps there ought to be more of a more interrogation of historical buildings within architecture potentially?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's such a rich resource for us all, what's out there, and I think not just your architectural education, but continually looking at those and learning from them, I think is invaluable. I mean, I think it's really interesting the way we call architectural practices. We use the word practice because I think that's what you're always doing. You're always practicing, and I think whether you're practicing at college or practicing in post college, you're always testing things out. A lot of it for the first time, so you can get a hell of a lot of tips and clues from the way other people have done it. Whether you like their style or I think it's enormously relevant, or you can find a way of it being relevant. Yeah, definitely.
I think as well, looking at like the plans as well, I think it's clear that that's really influenced your work as well in terms of like, the curves of like the Soane Museum and stuff. I think that perhaps I think there was quite a nice phrase that you said, looking at a building as a collection of rooms, and I think obviously your work has quite a interior heavy catalogue, I guess. Do you think potentially there needs to be more influence placed on the interior within education as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I didn't study architecture at all, so I'm a kind of imposter in your field, so I definitely feel slightly yeah, I mean, I came to architecture through studying social anthropology, and I've always felt that sometimes the interior is overlooked by architecture, to its detriment. I mean, we spend a great deal of our time indoors, and I think sometimes architects neglect that to get the exterior right. So I think there's a really interesting there's a really interesting way to approach a building as an exercise, just to think about it from the interior out. I mean, I think a lot of studios might work in that way, and other people might test out projects in that way. But I definitely think there's an enormous logic in trying to do that. I mean, the buildings definitely should have a relationship to the city or to their context beyond them. But I think that if that means that the interior doesn't work or isn't able to perform its duty, then I think we in the profession have failed. So I think it's really important to study and to think about the interior. But I think the way we do it here in the studios, we often head down a route of thinking about the interior for a bit and then pausing it and then going to the exterior, and somehow they eventually find their way. But I don't think I don't think you should ignore one or other. I think they should both be thought about. And I think sometimes it's difficult to think about them in parallel. So it's sometimes good to approach a project for a period with one mindset, and then for another mindset, and eventually those two approaches should have a synthesis, or should come together.
I think that's a really good answer. I think as well, there's something quite nice about your final scheme that you showed in like the boldness of the ideas initially, and perhaps like not everything sort of came through because of budgeting reasons, but I think quite a lot of it, your final product was kind of directed by that initial boldness. I think that's something that everyone can take, I guess.
I think that I say this to colleagues here in the studio, and also to clients as well. Going through the kind of journey of cost cutting can be incredibly creative. I hate it when if it's approached in the wrong way, it's a nightmare. But if it's in the case of the theatre, it really distilled the things that were important. And there are certain things like the amphitheatre that were achieved with, for a few £100, as I say, just by that bench and the wooden seats, that concrete bench and the wooden seats. And I think we were so determined, as was the school, to have it, but we didn't have the budget for it. But I think it's still there in the scheme, and I think that it's difficult to have those constraints when you're in the student experience, because you don't have that constraints. But it's often really helpful to have those constraints, because you have to prioritize. That gate tower we had on the side, I don't miss it at all. It's back in that I've forgotten that we ever had it, really. All we've got is a little porch. So whereas the main piece at the front that we felt was just too difficult to get rid of. And I think you quite quickly shuffle, once you've got the constraints of cost in front of you, you quite quickly shuffle without even having to think about it too much, the order of priorities of what's essential. And if you just keep finding a way to make those things at the top of the list work.
I think in some ways that sort of cost cutting as well leads to almost a more refined palette of materials on the inside as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got one question from Delphine. How do you communicate such a developed level of finish and detailing with the clients?
Models, I think, often. Those drawings that we showed I didn't show the first project, but of the theatre, those drawings were shown to them, and that gets them kind of excited or kind of empowered to realise that those are not empowered. They're kind of on board, buy into the idea. So I think we had of that project, we had a number of models, but the most useful one I didn't show pictures of was a 1:25 model. So it was about 1.5 meters long of the whole theatre, with all the facade made, and that went backwards and forwards between our studio and the school, and ended up the school used it for fundraising. And I think it was those ideas were really cemented in that model, and difficult for anyone to try and unpick, because there they were. And so I think that was, I say models are very good. Renders are sometimes very convincing. They're often very convincing, but sometimes people don't really believe they're real, whereas somehow model is a bit more tangible for that materiality. So we certainly believe heavily in using physical models to test things ourselves, to design things, and then also to convince and persuade someone to buy into the idea.
We've got a question from Mimi as well. Following on from the above question, what procurement route did you take with the theatre? How feasible is it really to have this level of detail within design and build projects?
We did a traditional form of contract. We didn't do, and so it was just we just ran it through on site. If we've only ever done one design and build contract, and our experience with that was to go heavily into the detail at the beginning, so that the contractor was kind of locked into a level of detail that was that they couldn't get out of. That's what we did on that project. But now I say that, there's another way in which I worked at Chipperfields for a bit before I set up, and the way we did it there is that we did quite detailed Photoshop elevations of everything, which set out a very clear aesthetic agenda. And at that place, we didn't really care what was behind it, as long as it looked like that on the front. And that, again, cemented a kind of integrity, or a sort of an appearance of the space, which the contractor, if they wanted to find other ways to put it together, they could, but it secured it. So I think the main way to work for D&B is to ensure that even if you're not being paid to, you kind of mainline that detailing or that ambition, and don't rely on the contractor to do that for you, because otherwise that's where it gets diluted. And you often don't get paid for that, which is what's annoying.
We've got a question from Tom. Cost cutting clearly has a strong influence on material choice, but is there sometimes a compromise in terms of environmental consciousness, e.g. the use of MDF? Is this compromise one that we should accept given the climate crisis we're facing?
Yeah, good point. Well, I mean, I think that you're always faced with these scruples in a project, I guess. I don't know quite how bad our cement fiberboard panels are on that theatre. They've obviously got cement in them. They've also got recycled timber in them. Yeah, and where the MDF or fiberboard came from, you know, I think increasingly we should be super on it with that. We are the conduit between the client and the procurement process, and I think that the kind of agenda that we set up in the studio at the beginning of this year was to not really give clients options, just to present something that we think is the responsible route, and drive that forward, both in a material choice, but also just an aesthetic agenda. I mean, I've got 20 years ago, I did 18 years ago, I did my house, and it was the first project we did, and it's sort of been the driver for quite a lot of work of projects like it since. And one of the things I did at the time, partly because I liked the look of it, but partly because it was cheap, was I left all the existing walls just bare brick. I couldn't afford to do anything else to it, but I also thought it was nice, and it might seem surprising to you guys, but actually at the time, everyone thought that's a pretty weird thing to do. It was quite an unusual aesthetic. Now it's ubiquitous and it's absolutely everywhere, but at the time it really was what you didn't find it. And the problem with doing that is that I have kind of propagated a look which is actually environmentally irresponsible, because the amount of people that still come to us saying, I really like that, can you keep my old whatever barn like this? And so we decided a couple of years ago that we wouldn't just do that. We would just say to people, no, we're not going to do that. We can make a really beautiful space, but we're going to make it insulated. And if you want that appearance of sort of rugged textural quality that exposed brick does have, let's find a plaster, or let's find something that achieves that, because it's our job to put out images to people that they want, but equally tick that, the kind of responsible environmental box. So that's, I hope from now on that the projects that come out of the studio do that, because even if people don't come to us for a bare brick building, a lot of those images are out there on the internet, and they will be ones that other people say, oh, I want something like that. And so actually I'm propagating something that's unsustainable. And so I want to make sure that in the next 10 years, the images that come out of the studio are things that people go, I want that. And it's actually the only way to get that is by being more responsible. So that's our agenda. But yeah, the past 20 years, we weren't always on it.
I think that's quite a nice way to end it. I think giving it some of the architects that have previously dropped out of the architects to thing recently. I think it's quite a strong message to end on.
Yeah, well, I think it's just like I said about constraints. I think these things, we are in charge of those constraints, and I think if we put those constraints in, like it's got to tick this box. It just means that we have to be even more creative, which is what we enjoy doing, and that's what we're all training to do. So.
But yeah, thank you very much once again. It was a really wonderful talk. Next week, for all the people listening, we've got Foster Lomas coming in, I believe. But yeah, thank you very much again, once again, Jonathan, and I'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks